Hello. Thank you for joining us for a focus briefing series on MSF's activities. My name is Chiyoung Bang, and I work in the Communications Department of MSF Korea. First, I would like to remind you that today's event will be interpreted in Korean and English, so please press the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen to switch between Korean and English, your language of preference. As an international medical aid organization, MSF works in humanitarian crises around the world, including armed conflicts, epidemic outbreaks, natural disasters, and medically underserved areas. Our quarterly focus webinars are designed to highlight ongoing or underreported crises and share information about MSF's response in such areas. This year's final briefing will be on the ongoing refugee crisis in Chad. In Korea, there has been a lot of reports since the civil war in Sudan. 8 months has passed, but the neighboring country, Chad, is still undergoing severe humanitarian crisis. Sudan and Chad, we have MSF, a lot of activities there, and MSF's Humanitarian Assistant Advisor, Leah Cowan, here with us today to answer questions you submitted. During the presentation, you can also leave your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to answer them during the Q&A. Probably among the participants today, you might also have questions that you want to submit during the session. Please don't hesitate to ask the questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom screen. So before we go into the details, let's first watch a short video to report the situation on the ground, and then we'll jump right to our speaker.
People are missing the absolute basics. They're coming in with diarrhea because there's not enough water. They're coming in with malnutrition because there's not enough food. And they're coming in with malaria because they're not mosquito nets.
Nous avons reçu à ce jour près de 300 patients. Nous avons une équipe qui travaille à la fois le jour et la nuit pour apporter les soins aux personnes qui sont dans le besoin, aux malades qui sortent du camp d'Oran.
It should be easy to make sure people have enough water, enough food, that they have shelter, and they have mosquito nets. We need other actors and we need donors to be scaling up their response so that these basics are available to the people living here in this camp and all of the other refugees that have fled from Sudan into Chad.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much for having me here today. Very happy to present a little bit on East Chad and the situation in Sudan. My name's Leah Cowan. I'm the Regional Humanitarian Affairs Advisor for MSF, usually based in Amman. And I will go through a few slides with you today. So hopefully here you can see the first slide. I'm going to focus on East Chad, which is currently hosting 500,000 refugees or so in a very fragile context already. Chad is a very resource-poor country and facing multiple humanitarian and development challenges of its own. And I'd like to take you through some of the humanitarian concerns that we are looking at, as well as MSF's operations in the region, and some of the advocacy and communications efforts that we're doing to try and bring more attention to this crisis, which we're really sadly finding is quite overlooked and really lacking in donor commitments. So firstly, just to go through a few of the basics. As you saw from that video, the situation in East Chad is really serious. It's a massive humanitarian emergency. And we've had people returning from the field saying it's honestly a refugee situation they've not seen the scale of for many, many years. And the biggest concern is the gaps in response. So there are a lack of actors that are unable to scale up to cover basic needs like shelter, food, and water. And again, this is linked to the lack of funding available. MSF is kind of doing what it was created to do. So we're really responding to this emergency to provide life-saving care. And we're present in 4 different camps, as well as Adre itself, which is on the border with Sudan. And we've even had the Chadian authorities recognize that it's been partly due to MSF's leading presence in East Chad that we've managed to potentially avert a humanitarian catastrophe. So we've really been trying to support our operations, as well as highlight the big needs through strong advocacy and communications as well, and engagement with actors that should be involved, that are involved, as well as donors. And we do have quite a lot of concerns for 2024, because in parallel to the increasing needs, we're seeing not the most optimistic funding outlook either. So we really welcome your support any way you're able to bring attention to this ongoing emergency, will be greatly appreciated. But firstly, I mean, I can't discuss the situation in East Chad without first bringing a bit of context and understanding to what's happening in Sudan. So the Sudanese war erupted around 8 months ago now, on 15th of April, between the Sudanese Armed Forces, otherwise known as SAF, and the Paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF, the rival faction of the military government of Sudan. And what we've seen has been just very intense fighting. It continues actually in 3 hotspots: the capital Khartoum, Darfur states, where most of the refugees fleeing into East Chad are coming from, and Hordofan as well. It's been a very urban warfare, and really the consequences on the population have been extremely significant and very sad. It's a long, violent, bloody conflict so far, and actually many actors responding to the humanitarian needs before the war erupted were evacuated, and have not all returned. We've also just seen the gradual collapse of state infrastructure, and this includes the healthcare system, which was already in a very fragile state before the war. Major industries have also been affected, including food production systems, supply systems, and we're seeing the displacement continuing in the country, and people fleeing across the borders into South Sudan, Central African Republic, and most of all Chad, where most of the refugees have come. And MSF is also responding in these neighboring countries as well. And then lastly, access environment in Sudan is extremely challenging for humanitarian responders. We're seeing a lack of visas, we're seeing problems trying to get travel permits. So even if we have our staff in the country, moving them around is very problematic. And more recently, a blockade on movement of medical supplies into Khartoum means that we've actually had to start scaling down in some cases, even though the needs in Khartoum are extremely significant. And even trying to get travel permits for our staff to reach Khartoum has been very problematic. So the humanitarian impact in Sudan, as you can imagine, has been pretty significant. Much of Sudan already was reeling from political instability before the war started, very high inflation, outbreaks of disease, malnutrition, and poor access to functioning state services. But this is just exacerbated with the war. We're seeing displacement. The largest displacement context in the world is actually Sudan. So a total of 6.3 million people are displaced, both inside and outside Sudan, and people living in various precarious situations. All 18 states have been affected in the country. And we shouldn't forget that in 2020, Sudan received a lot of refugees coming from the Tigray emergency in Ethiopia. So there's refugee camps in the east of Sudan, which were already having below adequate standards and lack of services available. Access to healthcare has been worsened. Reports of 70 to 80% of facilities actually non-functional. And staff salaries are not being paid since the war began, but even before the war broke out, payment of staff salaries was a big problem. So lack of medication, lack of staff, and also a lot of violence, looting, and insecurity affecting healthcare facilities, including MSF operations. We've actually documented close to 200 incidents negatively impacting MSF's ability to access populations, and also insecurity incidents, which are also affecting operations. and that's just since the war began. Outbreaks of cholera are affecting the east and Khartoum specifically. We also have dengue, measles, and involved in this war, a lot of violence against civilians, including sexual violence and barriers to accessing care. And last but not least, the nutrition situation is pretty bleak as well. Sudan has always been particularly food insecure, but the forecasts are that by February 2024, we're going to see 15 million people experiencing severe levels of food insecurity. That's 7.5 million more than the same period last year. And malnutrition was very, very significant before the war began. We were receiving patients in our facilities in West Darfur, for example, coming around 5 hours away at points to bring their malnourished children for treatment because of lack of access to nutritional services. And of course, with almost any conflict, you're likely to see reduced agricultural yields, and trade routes are disrupted and people can't farm their lands. And there's also a lack of fuel and drought as well. So just to bring a little bit of a visual, here you can see the MSF-supported El Janina Teaching Hospital. It's in West Darfur in Sudan. It was very sadly looted, like many other facilities belonging to UN agencies and NGOs. MSF actually evacuated before the looting took place, but it's a real shame to see. And we're now we've regained access to El Janina. We're supporting the pediatric department, including the intensive nutritional feeding program in West Darfur, which is very much needed. The needs are very big. And just before we move on to East Chad, I'd just like to zoom in a little bit more on the Darfur states. Then on the bottom left corner of the map, that green area is all where Rapid Support Forces, RSF, have taken control. And the majority of arrivals in East Chad have really come over from the Darfur states due to ethnically driven violence and mass killings, unfortunately. And these are deep-seated tribal divisions that have been reignited. And this kind of violence was beginning in the early 2000s, around 2003. So again, the majority of those affected have been civilians. There's been a large perpetration by RSF and allied Arab militia groups who've conducted like weeks of attacks on the Masalit. And they're the majority of the ethnic African tribe in El Janina and West Darfur. And now there are reports that they estimate 90% of Masalit have actually fled West Darfur. And human rights investigations are ongoing. They've actually been set up by the International Criminal Court, and the UN fact-finding mission as well is focusing on all the atrocities that have taken place in West Darfur. And Human Rights Watch have uncovered mass graves. And the EU and UN have warned that the world cannot repeat the genocide that was witnessed in the early 2000s. And MSF ourselves, like we have spoken to refugees who've detailed extreme violence, including ethnic-based profiling, targeting killings, sexual violence, beatings and burning down of their villages, and attacks as they're trying to leave to flee to West Darfur as well, including of women and even babies strapped onto their backs. So a very sad situation. And lastly, I mean, there have been efforts to try and establish peace talks, but these are not resulting in any agreement on a ceasefire, unfortunately. The latest updates on this is that there's commitments by the warring parties to facilitate humanitarian access via the UN coordination body, OCHA, but it remains to be seen if this agreement is upheld and if we see the results on the ground. So that's the rather depressing situation for Sudan. Let's move on to East Chad, where we have our large operations underway. So we're seeing a vast refugee crisis, as you know, in East Chad. They are rough estimates, but at least 570,000 new arrivals this year. And I need to stress that that's on top of 400,000 existing Sudanese refugees that have been there since fighting began decades ago in Darfur. And on top of this, around 80 to 100,000 returnees who are in Sudan, but are from Chad. And we think that these numbers are an underestimate because some people are coming in across the border in like informal or non-registered points. So they're not even counted. And of course, this is putting a lot of pressure on the host communities, on the local resources. And we've really seen the creation of a new emergency, a big kind of rapid attempt to create new camps. But this hasn't been at the speed that's needed, with many services missing. And there's even expectations that over 250,000 potentially new refugees could arrive next year, particularly if North Darfur is attacked, which remains to be seen. Sudan is the largest refugee hosting country, East Chad, sorry. Over half of the refugees from Sudan have come to Chad. And at the height of the arrivals, around July, August, we were seeing 2,000 people arriving a day. And now it's gone down to around 200, but it can fluctuate a lot. Earlier in November, we saw 8,000 people coming just over one weekend due to the attacks on the Masalit, which killed up to 1,000 people. These are the reports we've had. And just to give you an idea of kind of the scale and setup of the situation at the border, this is Adre, which is about 30 kilometers from El Janina town itself. So it's right at the border with Sudan. And it's, along with kind of Adre city and the surrounds, about 150,000 people. It's an informal camp, so there's no real organization. It's not in blocks it's like a transit area. And there's a big lack of actors here. It's very dispersed, as you can see. MSF supports a large secondary healthcare hospital in Adre town, and primary healthcare facilities and mobile clinics around Adre to try and reach people because the distances are so big. And then here, Urang, it's about 30-ish kilometers inland from Adre. It's about 50,000 people, but we expect 15,000 more families will arrive here. And it's more organized, it's a formal camp, but it's still lacking a lot of essential services, including 5,000 shelters for people. So this is just a little summary of MSF presence in East Chad. As I said, like Adre town and Adre camp, and then the newer camps, most recently Meche camp is now hosting 40,000 people, but it only started with around 4,000 to 5,000 people. And then further on, we've got Silla, where we're seeing a lot of returnees, and we're trying to reach as many people as we can, both with secondary healthcare and primary healthcare, and some very big hospitals as well. But we're also doing, as you see, non-food item distributions. So we're finding such gaps in the response that we're actually having to step in sectors where we don't always provide services. So in East Chad, the medical humanitarian situation is very challenging. We're seeing dengue, high cases of dengue, some measles cases, and always a risk of cholera coming over from Sudan. And the main morbidities we've treated are malaria. That accounts for actually around 2/3 of our current emissions. But we're coming towards the end of the malaria peak. There are no mosquito nets in the camps available for people. Respiratory tract infections are very high now, acute watery diarrhea. There's a real shortage of water, so people are not always accessing safe drinkable water. There's also a rise in skin infections, and we've treated an awful lot of malnutrition cases. Violence against civilians, as you have heard, has been significant, and people have endured extremely traumatic journeys from West Darfur especially. But we're also seeing cases of sexual violence in and around the camps. Women are starting to leave the camps at night to the surrounding areas to try and find basic resources like wood for cooking. This is when there's not surveillance. So they're taking great risks to get some of their basic needs covered. And of course, this is when they are more vulnerable to attack. But overall, between Urang, Adre, and in El Janina, we've actually documented over 160 cases of sexual violence of people that come to be treated in our facilities. And this is a huge underestimation of the actual violence that's being perpetrated. Many people will not come forward. And yeah, just to underscore again the vulnerability of the people that are arriving in East Chad, it's around 80% of women and children. There are also many unaccompanied minors, young boys of fighting age that made it across to East Chad alive, remain very vulnerable, and there are also a lot of elderly. And we've spoken to quite a few refugees, of course, to listen to their experiences of coming over the border and extremely traumatic journeys, losing relatives, family on the way, being stopped at various checkpoints, ethnically profiled, witnessing killings. And many people arrived with nothing on them in the early stages of the conflict, arrived with no shoes. And you'll see the last two quotes here. We have no food, no money to buy food. We're obliged to eat the grasses we find here. We have nothing. I even crossed the border without shoes. And I think we just have to really understand that people in many cases have lost everything or left everything behind in West Darfur and then arrive to a camp where there's a complete inadequacy of services and really struggle to make ends meet on arrival in spite of everything they've been through. So on the sector of food and nutrition, people were coming to our teams in the camps really appealing for food in the first months of the emergency. So it was initially the #1 concern. People are arriving malnourished and there was no food distributions available for almost 5 to 6 weeks after the start of the emergency response. That's now improved. WFP did start food distributions, but we have treated 14,000 malnourished people in outpatient programs around Adre, and nearly 3,000 children in really serious conditions have had to be hospitalized because they've been so malnourished. And the majority of those were between June and October. What's really concerning to us is the cost of food distributions in East Chad, the number of people that need to be reached with food distributions, and the lack of funding that's being allocated to this. So WFP are telling us it costs $25 million to feed 800,000 people with 1 meal per day per month. And they just can't secure the funding. And they're actually sharing the news that distributions might end from January 2024 due to the lack of funding. So we're doing a lot of advocacy on this front because we have to understand that people are completely reliant on food assistance in this area. There's nothing around, they can't find any land or have any access to land that they can produce or have any agriculture on. So they really need food assistance, unfortunately, and we need to ensure that that reaches them. And even as MSF, I mean, at times we've had to invest in the past on food distributions when really as a last resort, but it's cost an awful lot and it's a huge logistical operation to feed hundreds of thousands of people, and absolutely would not be able to do it for very long, and we certainly can't do it alone. So we're really advocating for the food and nutrition actors to receive donor money. Water has now become the most urgent priority in East Chad. The whole area is really struggling with access to water in itself, even before the refugee population arrived. When we came to East Chad, we were finding that people were accessing just 1 liter of water a day. And to give some perspective, the MSF standard is 20 liters per person per day. Now we've managed to help increase this to 5 to 6 liters per day per person in Adre and Meche, the new camp, and around 10 liters per day in Urang camp. But it's still really inadequate. And people, have been drinking from wadis during the rainy season. And now that the levels of the wadis, the rivers, have dramatically reduced because it's dry season. It's also an area that's known for cholera. And digging the boreholes, we've dug over 11, but it's an extremely technologically challenging thing to do. The land is very, very hard. It's basically rock soil, especially in Urang camp, and it takes a lot of specialist equipment. And what's even more concerning is that the water table is starting to reduce. So this is also affecting the access to water for the local population. We're actually calling on experts and kind of hydro geological specialists who are doing studies on the water reserves, because we really need a solution to this. And, you know, we don't want to see further displacement in East Chad because people don't have water to drink. And it's really affecting all the camps. So if anyone out there watching has any solutions, we'd be very happy to hear. And here, this is just a photo of a refugee waiting with their jerry cans to fill up water. And in the early stages of the response, people were starting to queue at 3 a.m. in the morning just to get 1 liter of water. So really inadequate. And now, I mean, MSF are providing around 1.2 million liters of water per day in Adre and Urang. And this is pumped and treated and distributed around the camps. But yeah, a really big operational and logistical endeavor. So linked to the water situation, latrines and sanitation. There is only 1 latrine per 300 people in East Chad. MSF have constructed hundreds just in Urang and Adre alone, over 600, but it's not enough. Adre, only 15% of the number of latrines needed have been constructed. And in Urang and Meche, less than half. So a lot of people are resorting to open defecation. And we're also really concerned by the quality of some of the latrines that are being constructed by other actors. So we understand, you know, it's a very difficult terrain to dig into, but some actors are digging just like 30 centimeters deep. So you can imagine with tens or hundreds of thousands of people, these toilets are getting filled up within 1 or 2 hours. So people can't use them anymore. And they're not being maintained properly. So there's a big problem with desludging and a lack of proper waste management. And these, of course, lead to more concerns about having water, communicable diseases and waterborne diseases are much more likely. So to support all of this and really bring attention to the situation in East Chad, we've been doing some strong advocacy on the topic, and the priority has really been to encourage donor mobilization. So we need to see more funds coming to East Chad. We need to see that being sustainable, the actors can really scale up and deliver those essential services. We've also wanted to try and improve the coordination of the response, and we've seen some improvements in this area, which is good. Initially, it was a very slow startup. We were finding that people weren't really recognizing the real urgent needs of the emergency. And we've also been drawing attention to try and improve the quality of the response. Like I mentioned, on the poor quality latrines, it's really important that people have access to services that are going to last and that are relevant also to their needs. But in summary, I'd say funding for 2024 is a big challenge. Globally, we're seeing increased humanitarian needs, and in parallel to this, we're seeing the reduced funds. And of course, unfortunately, the reality is that emergencies are competing. So earlier this year, we also saw earthquakes around the same time. The situation in East Chad started to get really serious. So that in Syria and Turkey, Afghanistan, Morocco. Then there were the dramatic floods in Libya. And of course, now we've got the situation with the war in occupied Palestine territories and the war in Ukraine. So yeah, in the context of these kind of competing crises, we really feel like the humanitarian communities should also try and broaden their donor base. So we've been engaging with the non-traditional donors as well, such as UAE and Kuwait and Arab states. And we're really trying to keep this overlooked refugee situation on the table. And just as a last slide, like to make it a little bit more concrete what the MSF advocacy and communications has looked like, we've done a lot of networking, donor mapping to see who's out there, who's responding, who we can put pressure on. Advocacy briefings and meetings. These have been bilateral, they've been semi-public, coordination forums. We wrote a briefing note to really outline clearly the key concerns in East Chad. Writing letters now to the chief of some UN agencies to express our concerns and providing updates on the situation. And in Dakar, we did a regional briefing for all humanitarian actors and donors to come and listen to us. And I think the number one thing here is that we have to remain persistent. It's not like we can inform people and then step away, but we need to keep applying pressure and keep highlighting the needs and elevating these from East Chad. Our communication colleagues have also been really instrumental in supporting the advocacy efforts and really bringing attention and visibility to the situation. Multiple press releases from the very beginning, and wide media coverage. I think you saw that clip at the beginning with Trish Newport, the head of our emergency desk. That was viewed over 60,000 times on Instagram. Media briefings and really trying to activate journalists and hosting media visits actually on the ground, so that we get more exposure of the situation, has all been very important. And I think we're seeing some outcomes. We are seeing increased attention in the last months. There has been the improved coordination at ground level, and we've had increased communication, improved communication with other actors. In terms of funding, some commitments have come in from the EU via ECHO, and the UK institutional donor FCDO has pledged 10 million to the East Chad situation. The Swiss Development Corporation have also said they will allocate some funds. But ultimately for 2024, it's just a really challenging situation. Major donors across the board are facing cuts to their funding. So we're really just going to keep East Chad situation on the table and keep highlighting the concerns as far as we can. And lastly, I just want to say a huge thanks to our amazing hardworking colleagues who are in the field, especially both in Sudan and Chad, working in extremely difficult contexts, many challenges, and they are facing this every day. And lastly, thanks a lot for your support. We really appreciate having this visibility on your platform, so thanks to MSF Korea. And please join us in sharing our communications materials on East Chad and Sudan. You'll be very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, for the presentation. It was very informative. I think if we look at the crises in Chad, we had a good introduction into the background of the trigger of the crisis and what the MSF's activities and responses are. And it was a very overall comprehensive picture. So now I think we can go into the Q&A. We did have some pre-registered questions, so we'll try to pick a few of them to present them to Leah to answer. If we look at the Chad humanitarian crisis, it's an emergency crisis. So we would say there are, of course, hospitals that are well established, but they are not accessible. We cannot use such hospitals. So at MSF and also at MSF Korea, we have displayed images of inflatable hospitals. And we did some communication around that to show how that works. I think this was a question after seeing that post. So how do these inflatable hospitals work? Do they also perform surgeries there? What is the size of the hospital? How many beds are in one tent? And of course, they would be quite different from hospitals that are very well functioning. So in terms of the cleanliness, the readiness of the operation and the surgery room and such, we think there will be a lot of challenges. So I think it was a question asking about inflatable hospitals in general.
Sure. We actually have 2 inflatable hospitals in East Chad at the moment. In Adre, it was established to cope with a huge influx of refugees that came towards the end of July. It's 170 beds, so a big hospital, and it's kind of an extension of the main facility that's already in Adre city. It takes around 50 people to set up the hospital, and this one has 2 operating theatres, as well as a maternity, there's an X-ray, a lab, and it's basically like multiple tents that are inflated using a really big pump. And what's quite smart is those pumps are then used to help with the serve as kind of air conditioning units. And yeah, I would say like it's a life-saving hospital, and it's been used in past emergencies before. So in the Nepal 2015 earthquake, we used them, as well as in Syria and Haiti. And we've also got a hospital in Urang that's semi-inflatable. That's about 100 beds, but it has a capacity to be increased to 150 beds. In that one, we don't have an operating theatre. We actually refer patients to Adre for surgical care.
Yes, thank you for that answer. Next question is that, MSF, we have a lot of activists from different professions beside medical staffs, right? So what type of activists do we have in Chad, and for how long do they work in this region? Could you please answer this, please?
Sure. So MSF staff from all backgrounds are welcome to work with us in Chad. At the moment, we're generally offering 3-month contracts because we're still in the emergency phase. So we tend to rotate our teams and make sure people get adequate rest. But we also have the regular mission in Chad, which I didn't really discuss. And there we're mainly responding to vaccination needs, and the positions there are longer. The coordination base is in N'Djamena, in the capital of Chad. So positions are 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months or so. And yeah, we also mustn't forget that MSF local staff are really the backbone of our operations. So we're recruiting both Sudanese refugees as well as Chadians for the emergency response in East Chad at the moment.
Yes, thank you. And when such emergency crises occur, I think there will be a lot of different humanitarian organizations that come into the region to provide support. Other than MSF, are there any other international organizations working in Chad? What kind of organizations would they be? And in connection to this question, is MSF also a member of the Humanitarian Assistance Cluster? And for example, to ensure that there's not duplication of crises response, how is work allocated among different organizations to ensure that the support is being provided in an effective manner? So to ensure that if organizations only work in one area, it might not be efficient. So there probably will be allocation among different work and different work streams. So if you could tell us how that works, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, the short answer is yes, there are absolutely other actors in East Chad. I mean, it's a colossal refugee emergency, and MSF would never be able to cope with it alone. So the main UN agencies are there, and large NGOs as well. MSF attends coordination platforms, and there are relevant cluster meetings within that as well. For example, for water sanitation, food security cluster, health cluster. We attend as observers, but we do coordinate with the other organizations, although there's always room to improve. And we do this also in a way because it's really central to our advocacy at field level. So it's to highlight unmet needs and the gaps and challenges to the response, but it's also to avoid duplication. And it's an opportunity for us to bring attention to the quality concerns that we're seeing as well in the camps. So yeah, and I think engagement in these coordination platforms is just really important to encourage accountability of other actors, also ourselves. It does help to streamline activities, but point to the needs and the gaps as well.
Yes, thank you for that answer. And we have a live question. So at the moment, I think this is something you mentioned in the presentation, in Gaza, Ukraine, there are a lot of other, crises happening that are getting more attention. So throughout the world, we have all of these humanitarian crises throughout the world. So MSF, among these crises, how does MSF prioritize out of these many crises that are happening? Because we have all these funds that we get donated. How do we choose the different regions? So that was the question.
It's a great question. Firstly, MSF is really guided by the principle of impartiality. So that means we prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable, and we're seeking to assist where the needs are greatest. And to do this, we undertake independent assessments. So we try and get an informed view of the needs in any context where we can gain access. And based on that, that informs our decision making. Whilst very publicized crises such as Ukraine, Gaza are very visible in the public eye, MSF does work in many countries which are not receiving the attention they need, such as the situation in East Chad, but as well Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen, Democratic Republic of Congo, Lebanon, etc. So MSF remains committed to supporting the needs of neglected crises and also advocating to bring attention to the hardships and challenges people face. That is really central to the work we do, especially in protracted crises where you just don't see the attention maintained on these situations. And I think, and I didn't really mention that in the presentation, but like East Chad crisis is not going anywhere anytime soon. This is a response that's going to be around for years and years to come. And the vast majority of people have no intention to return to Sudan, and it's not safe for them to do so. So we do believe that like donors must commit to predictable funding and support people in East Chad, Chad as a whole, and these other neglected crises, especially when people have very little other options available to support themselves, which of course is really saddening in itself.
Yes, definitely. We also have another question in the chat and a lot of pre-registered questions as well. So I think we will try to combine them and to ask the question to Leah. So in our previous focus briefing, we talked about mental health. There are a lot of activities on mental health support as well. We had a briefing series on that. Also in Korea, there's been a lot of interest on the mental health topic as well. So on site in the regions, when you look at the refugees, are there such mental health related support that's being provided? And East Chad, there would be also staff that's returning from their support activities. And we have a person in MSF Korea actually returned recently. And he said that actually the emergency response in Chad is much larger in terms of size, and the living conditions are actually very severely undersupported. So are there any kind of support for staffs that have worked in such areas? How does the staff also work to manage stress? And also for the refugees, I think you did mention in your presentation, but they are exposed to different types of violence. So are there any mental health support programs that are provided for the refugees as well?
Yeah, your colleague is absolutely right. The mental health needs are huge. And in addition to the lack of kind of basic services, and people have fled really terrible situations and persecution in the Darfurs. We have mental health activities running in the camps, and we do have teams that go around the camps to do sensitization activities on health concerns, but also highlighting the services available to them, including mental health. But the needs are huge, and there are not enough actors responding to mental health concerns at all. And I'd like to take the opportunity to link in education, which has been seen as a huge need because the population coming to East Chad is so young, and they don't have anything to do, and they've been taken out of school, and their complete lives have been disrupted. So I think tied into the mental health is the ability to give affected people a sense of agency, and more of a feeling of purpose and empowerment. And of course, that also comes into education for the youth. And we are advocating with other actors, both on protection services and including mental health, and we'll continue to do so. In terms of staff, how does staff manage stress? I mean, good question. It's also one that I think is very individual. Everyone is different. Group activities, especially like cooking and eating shared meals together, can help a lot. A lot of staff bring their hard drives with films or bring books or board games. And for me personally, I've usually found a rooftop to watch like sunset or sunrise. I make friends with the local cats and dogs. I have my rabies vaccination. But most of all, I think having a supportive team with a sense of humor really helps. And it is your team that the sense of camaraderie and the support base that offers is probably the most important thing, to start facing challenges every day. And when you can share those frustrations with others, it does really help. And exercise, doing a workout on the roof or some yoga is always accessible. And institutionally, MSF also offer psychosocial support, of course, for all staff. And that's not just during the mission, but after as well.
Yes, so we have the Chad refugee program of crisis, and then also other humanitarian crises. And, of course, we have activists on site who have, different levels of stress. And, probably in Chad, the level of stress is higher than maybe other regions in these emergency situations. Stress management is, of course, important. And yes, I hope that the activists there, go home safely. We have the last question. During your presentation, in Chad at the moment, the refugee crisis, water shortage and food shortage, very basic things is this what we really need in Chad. So recently, in on the continent of Africa, we heard about all the challenges because of climate change. That's something that we really do hear about a lot. So in Chad, is there also some like a climate change crisis in Chad? And because of the food and water shortage, this isn't just because of this refugee situation, it seems. It's probably related to climate change as well, also due to natural disasters. So yeah, we're wondering if there's any crisis related to that. And also MSF, in such an emergency situation in Chad, what responses is MSF doing to that in the climate front?
Yeah, nice question. Absolutely. Chad is like one of the poorest countries globally, and it's very much affected by the impacts of climate change, especially by drought, floods, and locust plagues. Around 3/4, like 75% of Chad is desert, and it's really getting accelerated desertification from drought. Last year, there was flooding, which was the worst in 30 years, and that impacted around 1.4 million people. And there's just rising concerns over the effects of climate change as that increases. And I think it's important to highlight that the whole Sahel region is considered one of the areas most affected by climate crisis, like in the world. So it's very serious. As MSF, we're trying to reduce our environmental footprint in all countries by implementing kind of tangible changes to our operations, including introducing solar energy systems and reducing like single-use waste and medical supplies where it's feasible and where there are alternatives. In Orang camp, we've introduced a solar generator, and that's helping to support the energy provision of the hospital by about a third. And also this geophysical study that's being carried out to help monitor the impacts on the local resources regarding water consumption is also an effort we're making to really try and ensure we don't disrupt things or make things worse for the host community. And I'd also like to add that these practical changes that we're implementing, they're complemented by a really strategic global advocacy effort to highlight the impacts of climate change and health and on the health and well-being of populations. As an example, last week was COP28, and our international president, Christos Christou, he attended as part of the high-level advocacy and visibility efforts on the topic. And sadly, we're really seeing that the most vulnerable people are often bearing the greatest cost of climate change and all its consequences. There's still a long way to go, but we're trying to just make sure that these consequences are really highlighted in the public sphere and have a clear link to the health impacts.
Yes, so MSF Korea, we are also making an effort to that end because we do realize that climate change is a global crisis and it will impact us here in Korea as well. So, yeah, so we had some activities there which related to boreholes and whatnot. So, yes, as Leah mentioned, Yes, those who are in the most marginalized, who are the most vulnerable, seem to be most impacted by climate region, and it's very unfortunate. So, we really hope that in terms of this global health and sanitation, that more people support MSF and our activities. So, Leah, thank you so much for your time today. And we have participants here. Would you like to say some final words?
Sure. Just thanks again for the opportunity to showcase East Chad and Sudan, really overlooked crises that continue to get worse. The humanitarian needs are not going anywhere. And in view of the funding forecasts for next year, we just appeal to everyone to support us in bringing attention to these situations. And thanks again for your time, and it was a pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you, Leah. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of today's briefing. As we mentioned earlier, we have these focus meetings every quarter. And, we like to highlight, these crises that are happening around the world that are not, receiving the attention that it deserves. So at the moment, we do realize that the global attention is currently on Gaza, but of course, still there are all these crises happening throughout the world in areas like Chad and Sudan. So this is something that we just wanted to bring your attention to and raise awareness of. And so, yes, we really want to introduce this to you so that you can continue your activities and you can continue to provide your support and interest in these areas that are underserved and that are not receiving the attention that it deserves. So if you have any questions about today's presentation about what you can do, please just let us know. We have our website that you can contact us, but also at a quarterly level, we have job fairs as well. So if we noticed a lot of the questions today are about jobs, so please feel free to attend one of our job fairs, or just reach out to us anytime, and we would be happy to be in contact with you. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.